Welcome. My name is Tony Arend, and this is SFS Online and On Topic. This is a webinar series that brings in distinguished School of Foreign Service faculty and alums to talk about the most critical issues of our age. It's produced by the Georgetown University Alumni Association in collaboration with the Walsh School of Foreign Service. Today, we're honored to have with us my friend and colleague, Professor Abraham Newman. Professor Newman is going to be able to talk today about COVID-19 and globalization. Professor Newman is a professor in the School of Foreign Service and the Government Department at Georgetown. He is also director of the Mortara Center for International Studies. Abe did his undergrad at Stanford and his PhD at Berkeley. He's an expert in globalization, economic interdependence, and has written widely in the field. He's also focused on data privacy and issues connected to that and their implications in globalization. One of his most recent books is entitled Of Privacy and Power, The Transatlantic Struggle Over Freedom and Security, which was published in 2019. Okay, the way we're going to work today is Abe is going to present for a little bit, maybe 10 or 15 minutes, and then we're going to open it up for questions. I would encourage you to use the question function in your control panel. And now, ladies and gentlemen, my friend and colleague, Professor Abe Newman.
Great, thanks, Tony. I also want to flag that this work is in collaboration with Henry Farrell, who, in addition to being a professor at George Washington University, is an alumni of Georgetown University. He got his PhD there, so another connection to the alumni network. If you are interested in this research that we're doing, we have a website, which is down at the bottom of this slide, www.weaponizedinterdependence.com, and you can find a lot more about what we're doing there. So let me get started. What we're really trying to think about is where globalization is going. This project started before the coronavirus pandemic hit, but we believe that the coronavirus really it reveals a lot about some underlying weaknesses within globalization that need to be addressed. So there was this image of globalization that many people had after the 1990s, which we kind of think about as the fool's paradise. You probably are familiar with Thomas Friedman's book, The World is Flat, but there was this vision that globalization was going to produce win-wins, that everybody could benefit. The US and China had this policy of constructive engagement where we would open up and they would then participate in the global economy. There was even an idea that politics and economics would be coupled. So the more you opened, the more liberal countries' political systems would become. And so both in an economic space, but also in a political space, there was a version of globalization that really painted a very, I would say, very rosy picture. And we are living in a globalized world. And so if you think back, even back to the 1970s, there was no internet, there were capital controls, their production systems were largely national. And so really in the last 50 years, there has been a transformation in how the global economy works. We have global communication systems, you have financial markets that span the globe, and you have production systems. If you think about the Apple iPhone or really most products in the world today, they are no longer just confined within these national borders. So if we have these global networks, what does that do for politics? And here, Henry and my work, we're really questioning the kind of rosy picture, the kind of, you might think of it as like the neoliberal agenda that was put forth in the wake of the 1990s. And what our kind of core proposition is that globalization is fragile. And it's fragile because of its own kind of internal working. That two core propositions within globalization are first, that companies try to specialize. And as they specialize, as they become more efficient, that those create vulnerabilities. Moreover, as companies try to become irreplaceable, they want to be the key firm in a global supply chain. Once again, globalization becomes fragile. And so that image of the world is flat and that globalization allowed for infinite substitutability of firms is actually not really true. Instead, what we have is a world where many companies, in their drive to efficiency, lean production, they created weaknesses within globalization itself, and they also tried to create their dominance in the system. And as a result, they became choke points in that system. Okay, so that's the kind of the overarching takeaway of this project, is that the kind of the very architecture of globalization creates fragility within it. So how does this play out today? And here, this is a simulation that was done not about COVID, but about just a flu pandemic. And what you see is that in a world of globalization, it's very easy for diseases to spread. And here you just kind of see an outbreak that starts in Asia, and then it quickly spreads across the globe. And in many ways, this is the consequence of having all of these global economic networks in place, whether it's air transport, vacation, travel, all of the world that up until recently we enjoyed and we took for granted also allows for kind of the pitfalls of globalization. But in addition to this very kind of stark and short-term consequence of globalization, the pandemic itself, the coronavirus also reveals these vulnerabilities that I was mentioning at the beginning of the talk, these vulnerabilities and fragilities of globalization. So I just want to go through kind of some examples of how the coronavirus underscores both the idea that companies had created kind of these weaknesses in supply chains, and also how they had created these irreplaceability, that they had to be the only actor. And what that does then in a world where there are these types of shocks, both the pandemic, that kind of a shock, but also security shocks, where there's increasing security competition between China and the United States. So the overarching kind of argument of our work is that supply chains, that they do not just create opportunity, but they also create stress and vulnerability. And here you can see that there has become a regional reliance on certain companies in supply chains. In particular, there have been a tremendous amount of reliance on China as a production center. And here you see that in the coronavirus with key medical equipment that are being produced in China. Even 3M, a very large US conglomerate, it produces a considerable amount of its masks and key medical supplies in Chinese factories. And so if you have a shock that targets one region, then that really ripples through the entire supply chain. And this isn't just about medical equipment. One of the key kind of examples in the consequences of the coronavirus has been how it has impacted the auto industry. So one example of that is in Italy, there is a company, MTA, which sits in the Lombardy region, and it makes many of the electronics for most of the automobile supply producers. And so when that company had to shut down because of the coronavirus, it had ripple effects throughout the entire auto industry supply chain. And what we just want to underscore is that supply chains do not always create redundancy. They don't always create substitutability. There was a vision of globalization that said, oh, companies will be able to play suppliers off one another. But what we're seeing is kind of the opposite of that, is that certain companies become, or certain regions become so important to these supply chains that when there's a shock, they can really break the entire system. So I want to move now to the second kind of argument I was making, which was the choke points that have developed within the global economy, the irreplaceability of certain firms. And here in the coronavirus context, you see the competition over vaccines and a potential vaccine for the coronavirus. So here there really are only a handful of players that can develop and then mass produce these types of vaccines. And this has led to kind of both economic competition between the great powers, but also security competition within them. So there was a story a few weeks ago in Die Welt, which is a major German newspaper, where they reported that the Trump administration had made a large cash offer for a German biotech firm that was leading the way in vaccine development. And the the details of this case are disputed both by the company and the Trump administration, but the German foreign minister believed this to be the case, that the US was going to swoop down and pick up a German firm under its nose. And what it suggests is that the kind of the centralization within globalization, that there are a few key firms that play an outside role in key areas, that can lead to strategic competition between the major players. In outside of the healthcare sector, you see this in telecommunications infrastructures. The company Huawei, for example, it's a Chinese telecommunications provider. It has become kind of the ground zero of competition between the US, Europe, and China over the future of the internet. Okay, so I don't want to take up too much time and not have time for questions, so I'm going to just do a last few slides. I want to just touch on one of the consequences of the two kind of arguments that I've made. First, that supply chains make these fragilities and that they also create these choke points in the global economy. That one of the consequences for politics has been a weird form of what we would call reverse protectionism. And that is that national governments have started to hoard key medical supplies in the supply chains in order to protect themselves and their populations. Traditionally, when you think about protectionism, it's about preventing exports of goods, it's about promoting exports of goods and preventing imports of goods. But here you see the reverse. The countries are trying to limit exports of these key equipment. And the problem here is that no country is able to really provide all of the key medical supply chain. And so what you start to get is what Henry and I call a sicken thy neighbor spiral, where each country starts to put in these types of protectionist barriers and nobody can solve the pandemic. You would hope that there would be some kind of global response through traditional international institutions that could overcome this. Here you see Gavi, which is an international organization that's trying to develop new vaccines in the international system. But unfortunately, the international community has not really come together in the face of the global pandemic to address these types of issues. Most recently, you've seen basically just infighting at the G7 over what should be the global response. The US, for example, made a requirement that the virus be called the Wuhan coronavirus, and that led to then kind of a collapse of any kind of real productive talks. I think this then stands, it sets us up for a lot of problems, especially when you compare what's happening in the G7 today to what happened in the G7 in the response to the global financial crisis, where the major economies of the world really acted in unison to address the situation that was confronting the world. At the same time, you have a kind of generosity diplomacy. This is a picture of Ursula von der Leyen, where she is thanking the Chinese government for the delivery of medical equipment to Europe from China as Italy is undergoing its kind of major hotspot period. And so you see China trying to rewrite the narrative of what's been happening in the corona pandemic to use these choke points or vulnerabilities in supply chains as a way to promote its kind of soft power or generosity in the international system. And this video, if you have a chance to check it out, it's really remarkable because the way it was used both within China and by Chinese media internationally to demonstrate China's role in kind of solving or addressing this problem. So let me just kind of wrap up so we can have plenty of time for questions. First, we want to just say that globalization is a key feature of it is its fragility. As companies like Apple move to just-in-time or lean production systems, those systems do not have a lot of redundancy in them. And so when a shock happens, they stress the system. The second point is the kind of securitization of health, or that health is not just an economic issue, but it is increasingly becoming a strategic issue. So when you think about the generosity diplomacy or the competition between China and the United States, they are using health as a wedge between the societies. The third point is just that I think we're arguing that countries have to move beyond the hoarding strategies that we're seeing as the initial response to the crisis. If we all just hold on to vaccines or key medical equipment, the world will be less well off. And unfortunately, it will be the poorest countries that will suffer the most. And so I think as the economically most advanced and wealthiest countries in the world, we have to step up and make sure that there is a cooperative and collaborative solution. And the final point is just that we need to think about what the world will view, how they will view the United States in particular going forward. I lived in Germany for many years, and when I was there, for most Germans, their key image of the United States was soldiers that delivered candy to war-torn cities after the war. And they would really forgive most things that an American would do because of that deep ingrained belief that Americans were there to help them. If you follow the German press in the last several months, basically the image that they're seeing is Americans as trying to steal medical equipment and vaccines from that country. And I think that if that kind of imprint, that narrative, could have far-reaching consequences for US alliance system and our ability to solve problems globally going forward. So with that, I will end the presentation. There's here, I just have up on the screen some specific articles that we have written and also some podcasts that might be of interest. I'll leave these up for a few minutes so that people can get them if they want. And with that, I'll turn it back to Tony for the Q&A.
Abe, that was fascinating. Thank you so much. So many things there on the table, and certainly a critical time to be talking about all this. We have a bunch of questions, and I'm going to try to cull some of them together. So we actually have two questions from one of my former students, Nick. And the first question he asks is, do you think we will see companies or firms being held to new standards for supply chain resilience as a result of anything? And connected to that, will we see a resurgence of manufacturing in the United States?
So I think that both companies and governments will have an incentive to rethink how global supply chains work. So if you think about international finance, we have a system of what we think of as systemic risk, which is to think about how the system itself can create pitfalls or failures that can threaten the entire system. And so you have solutions to that. And really, we need a kind of similar setup for international trade to also think about how that works. I'm reluctant, or I don't think it's just going to be simple reshoring. There have been people in the Trump administration in particular who've just said, well, just bring it all back. But the reality is that we can't do a lot of the things that we want. So bringing it all back will not be a simple solution for this problem. Instead, I think what you have to do is cultivate more redundancies around the key choke points in these systems. And so you need better analysis by the government of kind of where are the potential threats, and then how do we incentivize firms to create redundancies in those systems.
That makes good sense. Another question from Judy asks, what should the U.S. be doing right now, given, she doesn't use this term, but given the questionable nature of American leadership in the world, in order to get a better sort of communication strategy, a better PR strategy? If you were to advise the president right now on what the United States should be doing, what might that be in terms of public relations, in terms of a communication strategy?
Well, I mean, I think the question is, if it's within the context of the current administration, I think it has to be that that America first requires America together, that you can't have these salami tactics against your allies when you're trying to create a it's a common goods problem, solving a pandemic. As long as the pandemic is still raging in the world, we're not going to be able to stop it here. Similarly, a global vaccine requires international cooperation. So it's just not something that we can solve by ourselves. I think that might be a way to pitch to the current administration how they should translate this. I think if you're thinking about American foreign policy moving forward, then I think that what I would suggest is that we shouldn't try to go back to the simple days of the 1990s, that there's no kind of putting the genie back in the bottle, that we have to realize that globalization comes with vulnerabilities, that it has threats as well as opportunities, but that we have to take the threat seriously and not just roll up the gates. We're never going to be able to roll up the gates. And so we have to then think about, well, where are the fragilities? What are the vulnerabilities? And then target those.
That makes good sense. Connected to this, a question about international institutions. I mean, obviously, we have seen international institutions created after World War II to try to manage the global international system, and there's been a lot of critiques of failures of those institutions. If we look at the COVID-19 crisis, it kind of highlights some of the more recent failures of institutions, potentially the WHO. So I guess the question would be, what role should international institutions play in going forward on globalization? And do you think there is a useful reconceptualization of how we understand international institutions?
Yes, so I mean, I think most of the energy in international institutions has been put, at least in the political economy world, in the world that I study most closely, in institutions that promote liberalization, so the further integration of markets. So if you think about the WTO, or you think about the IMF, or even there's the bilateral investment treaty complex, all of those treaties, and there has been less emphasis put into international organizations that promote social protection and welfare. And so the WHO is a good example of that. And I think there needs to be leadership that says, hey, globalization is great. It creates a lot of economic opportunity, but it also creates all of these potential really terrible risks. And we need to then have international institutions that are dedicated to those risks. And they need to have the right capacity and power to deal with those. And so I think, like the WHO, for example, it definitely needs more authority to get information from its members that then can lead to better transparency amongst the community. It also has to have a better ability to coordinate vaccine production in a way that would force states to participate in cooperative and collective efforts.
Now, here's a question that, thank you, Abe. Here's a question that focuses on the divisiveness of the American political system, and one could probably translate that more globally. How do you think the United States, with the hyper-partisanship that we seem to be seeing now, can overcome that and can deal with both the challenges of COVID and also the challenges of globalization? Is there a way out of this partisan trap that we seem to be in?
Well, I mean, I think on the one hand, you see in the response to COVID, I think people pretty much understand what's happening. I mean, you see there was just this survey of governors, and it was, 89% of people thought DeWine was doing a good job in Ohio when he was doing stay-at-home orders, and 39% thought Kemp was doing a good job in Georgia because, he was basically, there is a reality out there when it comes to these really big issues, and we can see what's happening, and we know what leadership is and what leadership isn't. And so I think then the key question is thinking about, how do we as a society then use this pandemic in order to reframe how we solve problems? And I think one of the big lessons of the financial crisis is that we didn't really do that, is that the system went back to normal, that there was this huge economic crisis. People bailed out all of these companies, the banks, and in the end, the banks, the big companies, they didn't suffer at all, and they did not have to really reframe their business model. And you see that today on Wall Street. It's like Wall Street's had a record week last week. How is that even possible? So What I think you have to, I think the pandemic will reveal the deep inequalities in society, the grocery store worker that is an essential worker, and the people that can stay at home, like myself, which is, this huge lucky thing about my life. And that then we need to come together and figure out how we make this sustainable, because right now it doesn't seem very sustainable.
That makes sense. Now, here's a question, actually, several questions about China and the role of China in the international system. This was something that a lot of us were talking about way in advance of the COVID-19 crisis, that China really seemed to be a rising power that was in many respects challenging the United States in a variety of ways. And so the question would be, how has COVID-19 affected China? Will it have enhanced its power and authority in the international system? And what do you see China's strategy going forward?
So I think, this is a really big question. So I'll just riff on this for a little bit, but I don't
Please.
have, like, take it with a grain of salt. I think on the one hand, it has revealed the weaknesses within China, of particularly of a growing centralization of power within the Chinese system. So especially the initial response to the pandemic was a lot of cover up, which was very typical of an authoritarian government where power centralization is happening, is that the lower authorities, they don't want to admit bad stuff is happening because they could get signaled out. And so they don't want to report up that bad stuff is happening. So that's kind of an example of how the current centralization in China is creating weaknesses within the system. I think at the flip side is that the Chinese government has, at least on paper, it's always hard to know exactly what is happening within China, but they have marshaled a much more effective response to the pandemic than many Western societies, and particularly the United States. And so I think it's reasonable to say that they will be economically up and running again much faster than we will, and that will create disparities between our ability to maintain our economic and technological edge and their ability to do that. So you already see Hong Kong has had no cases of COVID for many days, and so that kind of difference, I think we're not even close to that. We will probably never get into that cycle. We'll be in a different cycle of just dealing with continued, sometimes they call it slow burn, but that I think will have much longer term economic consequences. This is more about internal politics, how we inside our society deal with things and they have dealt with it, and how that will then have ramifications for global politics.
Makes a lot of sense. One of the other questions, or actually a series of questions relating to the implications of this crisis for the developing world. Several people asking specifically about Latin America and the Caribbean. So any observations on how this will play out in the developing world? And I would obviously throw in parts of Asia and also Africa.
Yeah, the part of our research which I think pertains to this is that these countries are very reliant on global supply chains. So the more the United States kind of goes into this reverse protectionism mindset, the more at risk these other countries become. So the Trump administration, they created an order that basically said 3M, which is a large producer of masks, that they were not allowed to export those at all. And 3M then responded that that one of their large export markets is Latin America, and this would create a humanitarian crisis if they weren't allowed to do this. And ultimately, the Trump administration allowed some relaxing of that restriction, but you can see that these countries, they're not either in the US or the China where they have some of the parts of the solution. They have very few of the parts of the solution. And so the more the developed countries go into kind of this reverse protectionist strategy, the more these countries will suffer.
Another question, which is something that we've heard a lot of discussion of in the press, and that is the idea of not just this virus, but any viruses tending to proliferate in areas that are densely populated, so cities and other urban areas. Do you think our experience or the global experience with this will have some kind of implications on how we understand urbanization and the role of cities?
That's a very interesting question. And I don't really have a good answer for that. I think the it's always difficult to know if the last crisis will pertain to the next crisis. So, our last crisis was much more about the global financial system. It had consequences for housing prices, and they were often in the kind of exurb area. And so that crisis led to urbanization. It pushed people more into the cities. This crisis has kind of, in some ways, this worry that will density create the pandemic, but it's very difficult to know like what the next crisis will be and how that would really have consequences for urbanization.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, conceivably, you could have another crisis which would push things in the opposite direction and make it more logical to develop urbanization.
I mean, I think there is. Oh, go ahead.
No, no, go ahead, Abe, please.
I was just going to say that. I mean, I think the worry the worry right now for urban settings is that the long-term economic consequence will lead to will degrade the services that exist in cities. And so, people move to cities because of the restaurants and the museums and the nightlife. And if those things close and if it takes many years to get those back to where they were, then people will find less things attractive about the cities.
Another question's raised about global climate change and the connection to this particular crisis. Perhaps it's more, does the COVID-19 crisis either energize the international community to do more about global climate change because we see some of the implications, or does it kind of put global climate change on the back burner as we worry about other things?
So I think that, for policymakers, this is not a good thing for addressing climate change because it is taking so much energy and resources and, political capital to deal with these issues that, it's very difficult to think about how this can be replicated then to deal with climate change. If you think about the amount of money that's being spent right now to address COVID, ideally you would have exactly that amount of money being spent on the transformation of the economy into a renewable economy. And really, we could have done it. Like we could have used what is it? It's going to be like $6 trillion we're going to spend just in this very short-term initial response. Imagine if we spent that on transforming our economy. So I think that's unfortunately not generally a happy story for climate change. There is, I think, one interesting kind of thing that's happening, which is that companies and countries are experiencing what people talk about as peak oil, that there's this moment when the demand for oil falls and that it's really not an in-demand commodity anymore. And so if you look at kind of BP and what they've been saying in the last little while, or Saudi Arabia, these are countries that and companies that have always thought about this being a future that they would have to live with, but they're living with it right now. And so you could imagine them saying, we need to get ahead of the curve because this is, a devastating reality for us. On the flip side, I'm kind of cynical, and you could see them really digging in to create barriers to the transition to extract as much resources as you can out of what we have left of the period where we produce fossil fuels. If you think about the G7 response, it's really sad, but that is the one place that they have agreed to do something, was to prop up the price of oil. It's just a depressing, they can't agree on a vaccine coordination program, but they can agree to try to keep oil at, $50 a barrel. So I don't know. I don't think it's a great story for climate change so far.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree. A question about human rights, and I'm gonna focus this on an area of your expertise, and that is privacy surveillance. This has been something that has come up in many conversations. Places like China have developed a much more, if I can use the term, sophisticated way of engaging in surveillance do you think the crisis and the way to check the crisis has perhaps challenged the idea of individual privacy? Do you think there are going to be ways in which a surveillance system can be developed that respects individual rights, or how do you see that playing itself out?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a critical issue that whenever there is a threat, it often brings up the idea that the state needs more authority to monitor and surveil its citizens. So whether it was the communist threat, the terrorist threat, now it's the hidden enemy, the COVID threat. These are all they're all challenges that societies face. But the key for democratic society is that the response has to be embedded within democratic principles. Otherwise, you quickly turn into an authoritarian society where citizens do not have the freedom to make decisions for themselves. And when it comes to contact tracing surveillance systems, there are many proposals that are what I would call civil liberties enhancing, that they respect civil liberties as they engage in contact tracing. And it's vital that be a top priority for policymakers as they move forward. There was this shocking, and I was kind of disgusted, op-ed in the Financial Times about 3 weeks ago, where there was like a business executive who was like, basically, I did everything. I took every data I could find of my people, and I put them, I put them over the loudspeaker of who's infected. It's just like, no, like we have to respect individuals' privacy. The Apple and Google have this collaborative, decentralized contact tracing application, which I think is a great start. It's like trying to prevent all of the data from being housed in a one government bureaucracy where they can then use that to do, what they want with it. We have to be honest with ourselves that the rule of law is not so solid here, even in the United States, one of the best democracies in the world, and to then turn over the entire society's healthcare data to the government that's not anonymized and centralized it's quite it's concerning. So I think we have to develop contact tracing, but we also have to do it in a way that is civil liberties enhancing.
And one of the challenges too is with this crisis going on, there are a lot of efforts that can be undertaken to really restrict civil liberties that we're not even aware of, because there's just so much data being thrown out there and so many things people are paying attention to. I know there's some discussion about changes in the Patriot Act and what implications that might have for surveillance and the like. Now, here's kind of a fun question, if I can introduce a fun question. And somebody asks, what do you think about the development of virtual reality platforms that might be able to give people an opportunity to engage in either travel or sports activities, in light of the fact that we're not able to do these things person to person these days?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we are already seeing a radical time scale shift in people's willingness to adopt new technologies. So if you think about just Zoom as a technology, that was something that I think many people found it a kind of a curiosity. It was something where somebody was sick and so they had to come, oh, I think we have a solution for this. And now it's like a daily part. It's just so integrated. My daughter, who's 6, can unmute herself on Zoom. That kind of stuff is very quickly being integrated. So I think a lot of those technologies will be taken up because people are looking for outlets. At the same time, I think we all do recognize the limits of these technologies. And so it's great to be able to do this webinar. And I think it is an amazing opportunity to connect to the community and keep people informed. But I don't really think it replaces sitting, for example, in the Mortara Center, where we have the ability to look at each other in the eye and talk afterwards, get a coffee. It's like those kinds of social connections, the water cooler, those things, I miss those things. And I don't think that Zoom or virtual reality is going to be able to replace those very kind of sometimes things we just take for granted, social interactions.
It's so true. I've been having so many Zoom meetings, and I've been saying now, under other circumstances, we would be having lunch or we would be having coffee, but instead we're looking at our computer screens. Let me ask and I guess this will be the final question. So feel free to make any concluding comments. Somebody sort of is asking, what do you think the next crisis is going to be? And I guess the way I would phrase it is, if you can, look into the crystal ball and say, where are we going from here? Assuming COVID is with us for a couple of years, what's next? What's the next crisis? What are the next sort of leadership challenges? What are the next challenges for international institutions sort of projecting beyond where we are at this moment?
Yes. So, I mean, I think that there is really, we're going to face a choice. I mean, this is, I think, probably on everybody's mind. There'll be a choice in November about kind of a direction in which the United States is going. And I think we have to be honest with ourselves that we're a really important player in the international system. And so the choice that we make will be, I think, very definitive for a number of these, crises, whether it's the climate, inequality, how to deal with the pandemic. And I don't think it's any secret that the Trump administration, that their path forward is what I would call a nationalist. I mean, they call it America First. It is a very clear agenda, and it is one that has components of kind of deconstructing globalization in a way that would privilege American preferences or outcomes. It's not even clear exactly what it would mean, but it's a nationalist agenda. And I think that strategy would lead to globally less welfare. One of the things that globalization does is kind of a la Ricardo, is it allows people to specialize in their comparative advantage. The more we pursue kind of national strategies, the less global welfare will be enhanced. It also will present more nationalist-based global competition. So the US-China relationship will become, I think, a increasing tension in that relationship. I think there is an alternative, but as I said before, I don't think it's about going back to the heyday of globalization. And it is one thing that I'm very concerned about in a Biden administration, is one that was focused just on, can't we just put the genie back in the bottle? I think instead, you could imagine a Biden administration that was focused on a global economy that was producing a lot of welfare, but also recognize the vulnerabilities that globalization produces. And so I'm really pushing for, we need to not give up on globalization because it does produce so much economic benefits, but that we also need to not fool ourselves and be naive that it is simply a win-win. Instead, it is something that comes with risks, and we have to address them head on. And we're, the largest economy in the world. We have the resources to do that, so we should.
All right, I lied. I'm going to give you a final question. We got 2 minutes left. No. What should universities do right now in the midst of everything? And you can certainly reflect in particular on what Georgetown should be doing. What is it that we should be doing in this space in the midst of this crisis with the challenges of globalization?
Well, I mean, I think, it's really, we have that dual mission of teaching and research. So I think that we need to be, for me, the realities of where we are, universities are well positioned to say, these are the real threats to society, and here are the potential solutions for society. And so we need to be both using our bully pulpit to tell students about that, but we also have to be doing the research that gives policymakers the solutions. I think a larger kind of comment is that I am very concerned about the state of higher education in the United States right now and the commitment of the government to higher education. And so this is going to be a really big crisis for higher education, and higher education has been the driver of innovation and also employment in many states. I'm from Ohio. My mother worked at Ohio State. Ohio State University is the largest employer in Ohio. And so you need to think about, if you're going to let these flagship institutions go, what consequence that will have for, Ann Arbor, Columbus, Madison. These are all cities that depend on these institutions, both for, everything from janitors to, the lunch people to the professors. And so we really need to, in my mind, recommit to the land grant universities and make sure that they survive this crisis, because I think they are most at risk.
Excellent. And on that note, Abe, this was fantastic. A tour de force covering so many things. Thank you so much. And check out the links that he provided. Look at some of the work that he's doing, the work that he and Henry, our alum, Henry Farrell, are doing, and check that out. Let me thank also Kelly Young from the Alumni Association, who helped us out magnificently, and Eleanor Jones, who is the Director of Alumni Relations in the School of Foreign Service. This was her idea, and so we remain in her debt. I want to thank all you great alums for attending. Hoya Saxa, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Tony.
Thanks, Abe.